Well, welcome. So here we are. Y'all excited? Well, you should be. So my name is Brian Kniff. I'm Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. And I'm here to welcome all of you to our 8th annual Ignatian Values in Action lecture. This lecture is a very important event for our community. It's one of the many ways we introduce our first-year students, this year the class of 2023, to our university's Catholic and Jesuit mission and identity, particularly by providing for them the example of a book and an author who speak directly and eloquently to our university's core values and commitments. Since this past summer, our first-year students have been reading The Bread of Angels, A Journey to Love and Faith by our guest tonight, Stephanie Saldana. Now they have discussed it in our first-year seminars, and tonight is one of those great educational moments when we have read a book, thought about it, talked about it some more, and actually get to meet the author. At the same time, tonight's event is about more than just meeting the author. The Ignatian Values in Action lecture is also a convocation in the truest sense. At the University of Scranton, we believe that every one of us is called, that every one of us has a vocation. Tonight, we show that we are also called to be together, to listen together, to recognize that we have a shared vocation. But before we get started tonight, as dean, I get to be the person who gives directions. You'll be glad to know that I have only 3 of them, and they're very brief. First of all, for our first-year students, make sure you've swiped in. You seem to be doing well with that one. Your faculty and your deans will want to know you were here. Second, after tonight's talk is over, our author has graciously agreed to sign copies of her book immediately afterwards. She'll be right over there at my right, past the screen, the one that's been working. There's a little table. And there you go. You guys really are very excitable. That's nice. So, as soon as we're over, just go get in line, get your book signed, say a word, say have a nice evening thought. Third, and our faculty insist I say this, please give us your full attention. Later tonight, you can tweet all you want, you can Snapchat, you can do all those other things you do, but here now for the talk, just give us your attention. One of the great things about our Jesuit tradition is it is about attention and presence, especially for our guests. So, we ready to go? I will now welcome to the podium my colleague, our professor of theology and chair of our Department of Theology and Religious Studies, Dr. Christian Crocus.
Thanks, Brian. Just a few points. Stephanie Saldana is an author. She's written many articles and 2 books, as Brian said, The Bread of Angels, A Journey to Love and Faith, and the second book was A Country Between, Making a Home Where Both Sides of Jerusalem Collide. In the first book, our first-year read, we learn about a year that Saldana spent in Syria, making the unlikeliest of connections, including with a Jesuit monk, Father Paolo dell'Olio, who was a dear friend of and visitor to the University of Scranton. I wanted to say that because you can find his talk from when he was here in 2011 on YouTube. The second book is about the years she and her family spent living just outside the Old City in Jerusalem as tensions were rising among Palestinians and Israelis, friends and neighbors. Stephanie Saldana is an adventurer. She's a risk taker. She takes risks in travel, in dialogue, in peacemaking, and in relationships. One learns quickly by reading her book, but even more quickly by becoming her friend, that she moves to the heart of matters and people as quickly as possible. Stephanie Saldana is a daughter and a sister and a wife and a mother. Spoiler alert, if you're still reading, she marries Frederic. So that even when she's in a far-flung, exotic place like Scranton, Pennsylvania, she's at home also with Frederic and Joseph, Sebastian, Carmel, and Paolo, and Steve. And Stephanie Saldana is a witness. Those risky adventures I mentioned include travel to Iraq and Kurdistan, sites of devastation, and they include opening her heart to survivors and refugees who have lost everything in war: homes, schools, mosques, churches, security, health, neighbors, friends, and family. Or have they lost everything? In those encounters, our speaker has found incredible examples of love, sacrifice, fidelity, and hope. And in sharing those stories of what our speaker might call the hidden saints of our world, stories of holiness that would otherwise remain invisible to most of us, she becomes a witness to hope and love and fidelity. As she wrote in the New York Times after visiting the Moria refugee camp on the island of Lesbos, quote, "Those stranded inside are not humans to be disposed of, but Emmanuel, God with us." So we're very grateful for her witness. And finally, Stephanie Saldana is a friend, mine and now yours, and we're very fortunate to have her address us tonight. So please join me, University of Scranton, in welcoming our speaker, Stephanie Saldana.
Hi. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Okay. Whew. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Christian, for that introduction. And I want to thank the university for choosing a love story as the first book that you read. And so to celebrate that fact, tonight I'm going to talk about falling in love. about our entire lives as a love story. Because what I hope is that your arrival here at the University of Scranton is the beginning of a love story that will continue for the rest of your lives. And so I'm going to share a little bit about my love story with the Middle East, which is in so many ways the fault of the Jesuits, who I blame when I'm grumpy, and to introduce you to some of the people who I've loved. Because it might seem that a Jesuit education is about math and science and theology, and it will be. But for me, it was really the Jesuits who taught me how to fall in love. There is a beloved meditation, most often attributed to Father Pedro Arrupe, the former superior general of the Jesuits, but apparently said by someone else, Joseph Whelan, another Jesuit. But in any case, it goes like this. It says, "Nothing is more practical than finding God. That is, than falling in love in a quite absolute, final way. What you are in love with, what seizes your imagination, will affect everything." And it ends with a famous line, "Fall in love, stay in love, and it will decide everything." Fall in love, stay in love, and it will decide everything. Well, how did I fall in love with the Middle East? People keep asking me today. Well, it's really unlikely. I grew up in Texas, as you know. I went to Catholic schools, like many of you probably did, and I didn't know anything about the Middle East. I mean, nothing. I mean, we didn't even have like hummus in the grocery store, nothing. And so I just knew it was the land of the Bible. But when I was a senior in college, I applied for a fellowship to go to the Middle East because I wanted to see the place where the Bible took place. I knew so little about the Middle East that when I had the interview, the woman asked me, when you go to Jerusalem, what will surprise you the most? And I actually said, this is real, I said that there are cars. I have no idea why they gave me this fellowship, but they did. And there I was at the age of 22, so not much older than you, in Jerusalem, walking to Bethlehem. So I have a terrible sense of direction. It's like 5 miles. So when I arrived in the center of Bethlehem, I walked into a souvenir store. And I asked the man working there, am I in Bethlehem? He said, sure. And I said, I got my glasses so I can see you. I said, do you know where I can stay? And he said, I'm not really sure, but I'll try and take you somewhere. So this stranger took me to a street, and we went knocking on doors. Knocking on doors, knocking on doors. What I remember is that there were these strangers opening the door and saying, no, no. It was very Gospel of Luke. And then we arrived at a door, and there was a nun named Hannah, and she opened the door, and she looked at me, and she said, well, we always thought that we might have people stay here. I guess that you'll be our first. And she let me in. That night, they invited me to prayer, and they were praying in Arabic. And that's how I learned that there are local Christians who speak Arabic in the Middle East. And suddenly, I didn't really care about the land of the Bible. I wanted to meet the people of the Bible, because somebody had opened the door and let me in. For the rest of that year, I traveled in the Middle East, and everywhere I went, total strangers opened the door and let me in, both Muslim and Christian. Now, if you've ever been to the Middle East, you know that there's this crazy hospitality. So a total stranger will invite you to stay in their house, and then you'll go inside, and they'll just keep you there for days, and they'll feed you, and some kid will give up his bed, and then you'll make a mistake and say to the grandmother, oh, I like your sweater, and then she'll leave and come back and give you her sweater. And when I saw this, I experienced what we sometimes call in interreligious dialogue, holy envy. I looked at these people, these strangers, and I said, how do they love like that? I want to love like that. And I recognized the Gospels of my childhood, where we're asked to give everything away, and we're asked to welcome the stranger. And I somehow knew that the Middle East would be the school where I would learn how to love, and that these people who were welcoming me would become my teachers. So that should have been the end of the story, and I live happily ever after, but that's not what happened, because I'm really, really stubborn. And so usually God has to tell me things like 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 times before I understand. And so the Bread of Angels, which you read, begins after that first visit, 5 years after. In the meantime, September 11th has happened. War has happened in Bethlehem, where I was. And I've pretty much forgotten everything I learned. I've lost faith, I've lost hope, I've lost courage, and I have a serious broken heart. And not like the kind of broken heart that makes you eat ice cream and watch Netflix for a week, but the kind that makes you decide to move to Syria. And I'm knocking on doors all over again, because it turns out that pretty much every important story in our life begins with knocking on a door. It might seem strange to start a love story with a broken heart, But that's exactly where most of our love stories start. In the Jesuit tradition, we call these cannonball moments. If you haven't heard that yet, you will hear. It's after St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, who was headed for a military career until he was downed by a cannonball and stuck in bed, reading the lives of the saints. He started to realize that God had something else in mind for him. Most of the time, it takes a cannonball for us to realize that we can't do things on our own, that we need God to lead us forward. Spoiler alert, most of your spiritual journeys are going to begin with cannonballs too. Brace yourselves. In my case, my broken heart led me to run away to Damascus, and then to run away even from Damascus. And I ran away all the way to the desert. Let's see. To a monastery in the desert, up a flight of 350 stairs. And this time when I knocked on the door, it was opened by a Jesuit, Father Paolo Dell'Olio, Paolo. And my life would never be the same. Father Paolo, as you see, was originally from Rome. He was a Jesuit priest, and he came to Syria when he was a young Jesuit during the Lebanese Civil War. Things were really, really bad in the region, and in 1982, he went on a retreat in the middle of the Syrian desert. And there he had this dream. He stayed in a monastery that had no roof, and he slept beneath a roof of stars, and he had a dream that he would restore this monastery, right, out of the ruins. And he would create a community of men and women there, and they would live in poverty, chastity. They would work. They would welcome people. But the most radical thing is that all of them would take a vow to love Muslims and to live in dialogue with Islam. This was a dream he had in the middle of a war, and it was completely crazy until it wasn't. It became real. By the time I showed up, he was living there in his community, and thousands of Muslims came to visit every year. No one called in advance, and you could stay as long as you wanted. It was a miracle of love. Paolo was a giant, and I mean not just a giant personality, he was giant. I mean, this guy was huge. And he spoke English and French and Italian and Arabic, and he was always speaking all of them at the same time. And you would come in, and he would just be saying, marhaba, ciao, bonjour, and then he'd say, Stephanie. And you were home. And the thing about Paolo is that he would just say to you directly, he would say, why are you here? Why did you come? And that's because Paolo believed that when people meet each other, it's almost never by accident, that God creates meetings between people. And he liked to remind us that Christianity was based on a meeting. And that's the meeting between the Virgin Mary and the angel Gabriel. That Mary was basically sitting around minding her own business, and then this stranger shows up. And she's scared. But then she says yes. And Christ comes into that meeting. Paolo believed that every time we meet someone, when we say yes, the same thing happens. Christ appears. The turning point of the book, and honestly of my life comes when Paolo invites me to make the 30-day retreat of the Ignatian spiritual exercises. During this retreat, you go into the desert and you close your eyes and you pray and you see the sights of the Bible and you smell the smells and you ask Jesus to come talk to you. Like, really, I'm not kidding. As a friend once said, you know the exercises are working when Jesus starts telling you things you really don't want to hear. So that's what I did. Every day I went into the desert and I prayed, and I tried to put myself into the text of the Bible. After about a week, I went into the desert and I placed myself in Nazareth. And now I was waiting for the angel Gabriel to come. I sat and I waited, and absolutely nothing happened. Nothing happened because at the age of 27, I realized something which was really shocking. I realized that I actually didn't believe that God became man. I believed in God, hypothetically. I believed that he existed somewhere, but I didn't believe that he was with us. I thought, if you live in war, if you live in violence, then certainly God must be very, very far away. That night when I went to speak to Paolo, I said, I tried to experience the incarnation and nothing happened. And I started to cry. And he said, Stephanie, remember these tears. These are the sweetest tears of your life. And then he said something I'll always remember. He said, Mary was scared. And he said, that's right. We should be scared. Because something like the presence of God in our lives is scary. But then she said yes. And God guides her through her fear. The next day, I went into the desert. I closed my eyes. And I said yes. And God came to meet me. And the incarnation happened, and the whole world became electric. And nothing's ever been the same. And that was the beginning of my journey, and what will be your journey with the Jesuits. The discovery that Jesus is not far away, but here with us every day in all things. That Christ comes to meet us 1,000 times every day, in the wind, in trees, in that child laughing, but most of all, when you talk to one another. And he asks us to wake up every day and say yes to falling in love with him. I learned that the incarnation is not an event that happened once, but an entire way of living. God comes to meet us over and over again, but it's up to us whether or not we open the door. But when we do, as the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, who happens to be a Jesuit, said, the world becomes charged with the grandeur of God. I met Jesus in the monastery, and I even thought I might become a nun. But I really met Jesus when I returned to Damascus and discovered that the same world that I was scared of before was transformed and charged with the beauty of God. Oh. Yeah. I started to see every single meeting in my life, with my neighbors, with shopkeepers, with the Barone, my neighbor who kept making me watch Mexican soap operas and drink coffee. I started to see all of them as invitations to learn about God. And I started to understand that the entire world is our classroom, and that everyone we meet is our teacher. Syria was full of my teachers, and I loved them. I love them still. This is the Sheikha. I loved my teacher of Islam, the Sheikha. She, like Paolo, was a total force. She had memorized the Quran. She was an expert in Islamic law, a mother and a wife. But most of all, she taught me unconditional love. I am an American, and I was supposed to be the enemy. She didn't care. I'm a Christian, but she never asked me to convert. She just loved me as I am. When I used to wear the headscarf to her house, she would say, "Oh, take that off. You don't have to wear that." And when I brought my friend Dima, who's a nun, to the mosque, and Dima wore traditional clothes, when it was finished, she said, "Thanks for coming, but next time, can you wear your nun's clothes? Because I want to welcome a nun to my mosque." She taught me about the Virgin Mary. But more than that, she taught me to love my Christianity more. Because it was like the visitation. When I met her, something in me leapt up, then something in her leapt up. And I became more myself, and she became more herself. With the Sheikha, I began to experience a greater God. As you might know from movies, the call to prayer in the Middle East is called out 5 times from the mosque, and it says, "Allahu Akbar." This is usually translated as God is greatest, but it can also mean God is greater. Now, when you hear that every day, you think, greater than what? So every day I started to ask, greater than what? And then I would ask, greater than my sorrow, greater than my struggles, greater than my fears. Now, it was the French monk, Blessed Christian de Charget, who realized in listening to that he could understand the words of the Jesuit, Teilhard de Chardin, who spoke of a Christ toujours plus grand. It means an ever greater Christ. An ever greater Christ who calls us to ever greater love. The Sheikha invited me to teach at the mosque. Those are my students. And my students love me as I am too. And they even taught me about the Quran, but asked me to teach them about the Gospels. One of my favorite memories is when I taught them the story of the Good Shepherd. And I read, "The Son of Man came to save what is lost." What do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, would he not leave the 99 on the hills and go looking for the one who was lost? And they said, "Of course not." They said, if he did that, he'd lose all of his sheep. And then he'd really, really be in trouble. Clearly, they knew a lot more about sheep than I did. But I realized in hearing them the radicality of the story. It is a crazy story. It's a story about Christ who falls in love with us and goes to meet us wherever we are, even though it doesn't make any sense at all. The theologian Francis Clooney, who, yes, also happens to be a Jesuit, said that when we learn about other faiths, we see the world with 2 eyes, not one, to get 2 perspectives. He once wrote, loving God is always a risk. Yeah, falling in love is always a risk. There's always the risk that we'll wake up into a life that we never imagined. Jesus is like that. Once you let him into your life, you never quite know what he's going to do with you. Which brings me to someone else I fell in love with. There he is. Well, one day, while I was discerning whether or not I should become a nun, I went into the desert and I prayed to God and said, I want a vocation in love. Teach me how. And, well, they don't call him the God of surprises for nothing. I might have accidentally fallen in love with Frederic, a French novice monk, who I still fall in love with every single day after 13 years of marriage and 3 children. I won't. I won't embarrass him by saying too much in front of all of you. I did tell him he should come and just come up on stage, and then I wouldn't have to say anything for the whole hour. But I will take the moment just to thank him for taking the risk to live with me in the monastery of the world, for showing me the miracles present in breakfast cereal and backpacks and tying shoes and laughter. All of these years later, he's still teaching me about resurrection. How I wish that that was the story, right? How I wish that the story just ended there and we all live happily ever after. But that's not what happened. Before I came to talk to you, I spoke to my friend, Father Peter. He's a Jesuit priest now for 50 years in the Middle East. And I said, yeah, I'm going to talk to them about falling in love. And he said, yeah, falling in love, great. Have fun with that. That's easy. But staying in love, that's another matter. The Bread of Angels was a book about falling in love, but the Syrian civil war has been about staying in love. Because as you know, we live the cannonball of cannonballs, and war came into this book that you read, and none of us have ever been the same. The war started a year after the book was published. Soon after, my teacher, the Sheikha, was exiled and had to flee the country with her family. The Quranic school where I taught was closed. A few years ago, I went to go visit her in exile. She was no longer teaching. And she said to me, Stephanie, it's okay to be called a mother. It's nice to be called a friend. But there's something special in being called a teacher. Hud al-Habash will always be my teacher, and what it means to love without limits, to see the world with two eyes, and to risk. Father Paolo and I remained really close after I left the monastery, which is no small feat since I didn't become a nun and I married one of his novice monks. He even traveled to France to officiate my wedding. Yeah. As you can see from the picture, it's not quite clear whether it's my father or Paolo who's giving me away. I'm not really sure if they knew. Yeah. I'm just going to talk about Frederic. No. Paolo and I became great friends. We disagreed about pretty much everything. I mean, he was a pain, and I'm no picnic. But something about that even made us love one another more. He was a very faithful friend. He was famous for dialogue with Islam, but actually, if I had to sum up his theology in one word, I would say it was fidelity. For him, it really mattered that Jesus didn't just love us, but that he stayed in love with us. That as the Gospel of John says, he loved us to the end. Now, as you heard from Christian in the introduction, Father Paolo came to the University of Scranton in 2011.